Hey everybody, welcome to my session. My session today is called Agile is Dead, Here's Why That's a Good Thing. Now, I know what you're thinking. It might be sounding a little bit negative with the Agile and is dead stuff, and of course we've got a bit of the Halloween theme going on, just for fun. But we're going to talk about a very serious thing, and we're going to talk about the positive spin on perhaps some of the negative things that have been going around on the subject of Agile is Dead. So before we get started, I'm going to tell you just some basic contact information for me. My name is Todd Charron. You can find me on X at Todd Charron. That's TODDCHARRON. And you can email me if you have any questions or follow-ups at todd@toddcharron.com. So that's my contact information, but let's talk a little bit about me. So I got into Agile way back in 2005, which seemed very late at the time. I just heard about this Agile thing. I had started working for this company that professed to be doing extreme programming. And so I should learn about this Agile stuff and extreme programming, which I did. So I looked up the Agile Manifesto. I thought, that's really cool. I looked up extreme programming, said, that's amazing. And then I looked at what the company was doing. It was like, that is not this at all. It was a horrible abomination. And then around 2008, I got into Scrum. I think I got my first Scrum certification in 2008. I've been doing this stuff kind of ever since. Now, before we get right into it here, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to go a little bit high level, a little bit meta, and I want to kind of raise your thinking to think about bigger picture stuff. And then we're going to get down into the nitty gritty and details and the practical things that you might want to take away from here. And so my goal for this session is I don't want to be here to tell you how to think about things or what to think about things. I just want you to think about these things. Because I started thinking about these things a while back. And, even to this day, I don't have all the answers. And I don't think anyone does. But I'm going to give you my perspective, tell you the things and the patterns I've observed, and kind of the journey of the kind of Agile is Dead thing, which, again, is much more popular now than when I first started on this journey. So I'm going to take you back in time a little bit. It's actually been almost 5 years in November, that I gave the closing keynote talk at the Toronto Agile Conference in Toronto, ironically. Where I basically told the audience that Agile is dead. It was kind of a State of the Agile Union address. And needless to say, it received some mixed reviews. But this wasn't the first time that I had talked about Agile being dead. I had actually been talking with people about this probably as early as 2017, 2018 for sure. I've been going to Agile open spaces, and I had been posting up basically little boosts where I would say Agile is dead, change my mind. And it got some very interesting reactions. But here's what I want you to know about this. I want you to know that Agile as a movement, which is how I think of it, every successful movement has its moment, and every movement ends. And that's true of all movements over time. Whichever one you want to think about, it doesn't matter. It's going to happen to all of them. And that means since Agile itself is a movement, the Agile movement is going to end. So now going back to 2017, 2018, when I'm at these Agile conferences, these open spaces, and I'm doing these Agile is Dead sessions, change my mind. And I was really curious because I had just gotten this feeling. You get this feeling sometimes in the back of your mind and you can't escape it, and you bat it around and try and figure out, why am I feeling this way? So I did these sessions not because I wanted to convince people that Agile was dead. That was not my goal. My goal was actually to be talked out of it. I really did want people to change my mind on this. And it was fascinating, the initial reaction I got. It wasn't like, well, that's an interesting idea, let's discuss. Or, here's why you're wrong about this, or here's why you're right about this. It wasn't any of that at all. The first thought that everyone had was one you might recognize right here.
How dare you!
It was that how dare you moment. It was how dare I even bring up this conversation. It was like we had touched the third rail. And I just want everyone watching this to know that, it's okay. It's going to be okay. You can take a deep breath. No one is coming to steal your Agile. And if they are, you can just say swipe or no swiping. I hear that works if you repeat that a few times. So the important thing here I want you to remember is that Agile does not have to be your identity. Agile does not define you. So I can tell you this. So when I got into Agile around in 2005 or so, I didn't get into Agile to be Agile. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to look around and see all the problems that I saw and say, well, how do we make those better? Because for those of you who don't know, back then, the predominant form of software development was, what we now know as waterfall. We call waterfall. It was basically just considered the way we do software. If you were a professional software company, that's how you worked. Some people referred to it as the software development life cycle at the time. And it was, yes, that big upfront planning, separate development branches, big time development, months and months of development, and then huge integration, painful phases. Then, hopefully you get some testing towards the end. And it was a very painful place to be. It resulted in a lot of burnout, a lot of pain, and a lot of suffering. And when I saw Agile, it was like, oh, this looks better. This looks like a way that we can actually make our lives better and personally make my own life better. And so that was appealing to me. So the other thing that came up when I started having these conversations with people was the first thing people said, well, hey, what is Agile? Which is in itself a problem, by the way. That if we're in 2017, 2018, and we still don't have an agreement on what Agile is, that itself is an indication of a problem. So let's get back to basics. One of the most important things I think about the Agile Manifesto is not so much the values and the principles. A lot of people talk about the values and principles a lot. I think the most overlooked and most important part of the Agile Manifesto is actually the very first line. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. That's incredible. That is the essence of it right there. But that's a little different than what we see today. That's what it was back then, 2001. But that's not really what we see today. So we have to recognize that the Agile context then is a little different than the Agile context of 2024. So let's look at some ways the Agile context has changed. So when I got started in Agile, there was a certain amount of things you needed to learn, you needed to know. For example, I think some of the first books that I read was the Kent Beck Extreme Programming books. Had you read one, you didn't have to read all of them, just one of them would have been good enough. If you read the Agile Software Development book with Scrum, that's the red, yellow, green, that book, the Mike Beadle, Ken Schwaber book, and Lean Software Development, Mary and Tom Poppendick. Had you read those books, that was pretty much, you knew what you needed to know to go and do Agile stuff. That was it. But contrast that today, where if I'm a new person and I want to get into Agile and I say, well, what do I need to know? Well, you can just do a search on Amazon for books on Agile software development and you'll find over 1,000 books. Where do you even start? Do you have to know all of these things to have any level of expertise? What are the core ones that you need? It's almost impossible to know now. So this has changed in the way of what is Agile from what it was back in 2001. Another way in which it's changed is also who is Agile. That is the audience of people in the Agile software movement. So the audience changes over time. When I got started in it, I think 2008, I went to my first kind of meetup group conference type stuff. And it was very interesting because you had people who were very new to this, like myself, that came in. But there wasn't that many of us, but there was some of us coming in. And there was the people who were, what you would call experts at the time. But they didn't know that much more than you because there wasn't that much more to know at the time. So what you see is as more and more people come in, the audience grows, but those people who had expertise, well, they didn't stand still. So there's more people coming in who don't know anything about Agile. They're like, hey, I want to learn about this Agile stuff. And the people who know the most about it are still learning. So their knowledge goes over time. So if you look at my very, very scientific chart here that I developed, I intentionally draw it out like this because it's not scientifically valid, but it matches the observations of myself and most people I've discussed. Because over time, more people come in, but more people are getting more experience, which means more people are starting at 0, but it used to be a scale of 0 to 10, now it's 0 to 20, now it's 0 to 30. There's much more things you have to know. And then as it grows even more, as it becomes more and more mainstream, you get this massive flux of new people and a whole bunch of people along the gradient, and then people who are now far out trying many, many different things. And if your audience changes, you have to think about how this changes how you approach things. So for example, if you are a conference organizer or an event organizer, let's say like this conference itself, you have to say, well, who am I going to cater to? Am I going to cater to the beginner sessions? I'm going to have a bunch of beginner sessions, which might turn off the people that have been around for a while. They're like, my God, do I really need another session on user stories? Probably not. Not going to come to your conference. They're going to disappear. Or do I cater to the people on the far end and then I'm not going to get as big a turnout because, most of the audience isn't ready for some of the more advanced stuff yet. So it places organizers in much more of a conundrum on how to deal with this, which we didn't have, again, back in the early days when it was a very small group of people. And so what happens in this audience also is a different type of person starts coming to these events. So again, in the early days, you had what I would call the innovators. And the innovators are the people who want to be part of something new. They want to put their own input in. They want to have a voice. They want to have a say. They want to try things and give feedback and be part of that growing movement. They want to contribute and they want to learn. They want to do both of those things at the same rate. Then there's another group that comes in later, though. Because the innovators, they come in, they want to be part of the scene, right? They want to be like the cool kids. And they say, man, I want to contribute something. What if we did this? What if we did that? The builders, and again, there's no better, it's not better to be a builder or an innovator. It doesn't really matter. It's just a different perspective. The builders come in with a different perspective. And the builders come in, they say, I just want to build cool stuff. And some of you, watching this might be in that camp. Say, like, I just wanted to do product development. I just wanted to build really cool products for people. I don't care how we do that. I'm not interested in whether it's agile or not agile. I just want to build cool stuff. So they come into the agile community and they're looking for something different. They just want to know, what are the best practices? I just want to know, how do we best do this so I can get back to building cool stuff, because that's what I'm here to do. And that's a very different perspective from wanting to contribute and be part to developing the knowledge versus wanting to be taught the knowledge, because one is going to be more active, one's going to be more passive. This creates another problem too. As Agile starts to explode and more companies are saying, well, we need to hire more Agile people. We need product owners. We need Scrum Masters. We need Agile development experts, DevOps people, Agile coaches. The demand for all these people goes through the roof. However, the demand starts to outstrip the supply. And so now you have a lot of people that are very skilled and very talented, but they are booked solid. But it doesn't mean the other people are just going to sit and wait until they're available. No, they're going to go next on the list. Who has the next most experience? Who has the next most experience? And so what happens is eventually you end up with people in a position who don't have the experience to necessarily have the competence that, let's say, somebody who's been doing this, when I came in 2008, by the time I was doing stuff with Scrum with some teams, versus 2018, well, there are people working in teams in 2018 who've been doing this for a year, 2 years. I've been doing it for 10. It's like there's a world of difference between the two, but people don't realize it. They just want that. So I remember when I got started, when I first started calling myself an Agile coach, I knew I could count literally on my hands the number of Agile coaches I knew, and every single one of them was excellent. But then all of a sudden it blew up, and all of a sudden I'm seeing people who are coaching Agile teams, and I'm like, you've been doing this for like 6 months, because you want more experience from the people that you're bringing in, because people often forget especially when it comes to coaching or consulting with organizations, is you want to bring in someone that you can learn from, but you want to learn from people that are competent people that have real world experience doing these things. And there wasn't a lot of that at the time. And so a lot of people get into the space and they don't either have the competence or they don't have the experience yet. And that's caused a lot of problems, as I'm sure some of you have noticed. So something else has changed over time too. So let's talk about that. So the other thing we have to look at is, where is Agile? We talked about what Agile is, who is Agile, but let's talk about where Agile is. I remember back in around 2010, 2011, there were all kinds of talks. People were asking, has Agile crossed the chasm? For those of you who don't know, Jeffrey Miller had a book called Crossing the Chasm. They had a diagram where they showed the innovators. I talked about innovators versus builders. And you had the innovators there, and then there was the early adopters, and you could get those on. But at that point, you had to cross the chasm before you could get into the early majority. And a lot of businesses, a lot of movements, a lot of things failed to cross the chasm. They just didn't receive that mainstream acceptance. And so again, 2010, 2011, that was a very relevant conversation. That's where Agile was at that time, which is, again, a very different place than 2001, 2002, and around that, where you're very much in the innovator stage. So, when you go through this cycle, you end up in the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. And so I remember, again, when I started coaching teams, probably around 2010, 2011, we were very much still early adopters, early majority, and I was working with a lot of small companies. It was a lot of 100-person companies. It was a lot of startups. I think the smallest company I worked with was a 10-person company, and it was awesome. By the way, you can do so much so quickly with a 10-person company. It's very different than what you find in much larger organizations. However, contrast that with today, and all I see is Agile postings for people looking for work at banks, in government, at insurance companies. And I had somebody tell me a while back, they're like, that sounds like late majority. It's like, well, if that's late majority, who are the laggards? I mean, there's nobody left after that. That's everybody. And that's very different. And so a lot of things around Agile have changed since 2001. So as I went through and talking to people about these things, I started to think about, okay, so how do I model this? How do I think about this? How do I put this in something that I can explain to people what's happening? Because I'm trying to understand it myself. And I came to the conclusion of thinking of Agile as a movement. Because social movements are defined by 4 stages. They have 4 separate stages. So the initial stage is emergence, then it's coalescence, bureaucratization and formalization, and finally decline and institutionalization. And the thing about this is many of these movements can fail before they get through all 4 stages. But the most successful movement, it doesn't matter what they are, how noble their purpose, how successful and how much they win over people, they go through all 4 of these stages regardless. And I think we've seen the same thing happen with Agile. I'm going to explain that right now. So stage 1 is emergence. So we have to go back, going way, way back again, and recognize that Agile itself emerged as a backlash. And it was a backlash, as I talked about before, to the waterfall approach of software development. This idea where we'd had to do these big bang releases. We had to do 6 months, yearly releases. And, there was all this upfront planning and all these design approvals and everything, took forever. And you had integration hell and all that usual stuff that would happen. And this was frustrating for a lot of software developers, which I was one at the time. And so people had a lot of dislike and a lot of frustration with the way things were being done. And this sets the stage for a movement to begin. And that's where it starts, right? So we have to remember that Agile didn't start out as Agile. That's not the way it started. So we had this pushback against these heavyweight processes. And by the way, it was kind of like the Agile people that coined waterfall and kind of demonized it. And it's like, that's really great marketing, by the way. Really well done. But now we had a name for what we didn't want to be. We had this name. We don't want to be doing this waterfall stuff. It's painful. It has these certain problems that always happen, even if you do it right. What if we did something different? And this is where the emergence comes in. It doesn't show up as Agile in 2001. It happens beforehand. We hear about these lightweight methods. That's what they call them. And nobody wants to be called a lightweight, so that's why they rebranded Agile. But it was a bunch of people trying a bunch of different things. And it was a bunch of self-organized contributors posting to mailing lists, news groups, blogs, when those came out probably a bit later, conference talks and things like that. It was just people saying, I'm trying something different. Here's what it is. And here's how it's working for us. Why don't you try it and let us know if it works for you? And the feedback would come back and forth, and they would adjust practices and figure out what they were doing. And of course, as we understand, they eventually came together to say, what do we have in common? But we're not there yet. So Agile at this point is a do-it-yourself approach. It's that DIY approach. And that brings us back to the first sentence of the Agile Manifesto. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. That's originally how it started. That's what we were doing. And so we were trying a whole bunch of different things. We had test-driven development, which again still is fairly controversial today, as is pair programming. Imagine how difficult it would have been back even prior to 2001 trying to get people to pair program, trying to get test-driven development in your company to get that approved. I mean, they were really sticking their necks on the line to try out new things. Continuous integration was this theory written about that we had to do manually because we didn't have continuous integration software. And eventually you get things like Scrum, Extreme Programming, Crystal, DSDM. All these things come out to say, hey, here's how we're trying. What do we have in common? What do we borrow from over here? And then what do we take from over there and make our own thing and see how it works? All this happens in the emergence phase. But once it starts to gain momentum, you start to have some success, and people are like, oh man, something is happening over here. I talked about being a part of a scene. People start to recognize the scene at this point. Well, now we have to coalesce. This is where you get that meeting in Snowbird, Utah in 2001, where you get all those pre-Scrum ideas, pre-Agile Manifesto ideas, like Scrum, Extreme Programming, Crystal, Feature-Driven Development, DSDM, and you get a whole bunch of those people together, and you come together and you say, well, wait, we're doing something different than this waterfall stuff. What are we doing? What do we have in common? What can we call it so that we all have a word we can use where we would all understand what we're talking about? Yeah, that didn't work out so well in the end. But hey, at the time, it sounded like a great idea. If we just got a name for this, that we can all understand this is what we're talking about. And so in the end, you end up in 2001, the product of coalescence, the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. So I want people to take a moment to just recognize, because a lot of people say, well, maybe we need to rewrite the manifesto, or we need to, maybe it should have been different people there, or different things, or whatever, it could have been better. It's like, people don't respect and understand how rare this type of success is. You can search the internet for different approaches to software, different manifestos for software, all through the years that people have tried to put forward that have flopped, that have fallen flat on their face. Even since Agile, there's so many approaches that say, here's our new approach to Agile, here's how we're doing things, and they don't take off, they don't catch on. There really was catching lightning in a bottle in 2001, and that is such a special thing that we have to take a moment to just respect that happened. Again, not from pushed by some company or some top-down authority. It was just a bunch of people coming together to do something different. But now that you have this, and you put this out there, and people are looking at this, and they say, hey, maybe that sounds kind of cool. But what happens next is, well, we have questions, of course. We don't know anything about this stuff. We're just hearing about it now. Like, what is Agile? What makes a team Agile? What is Scrum? What is extreme programming? And so this brings us into the next phase. And this, again, is necessary, and it's born out of success. This is not born out of failure. And a lot of people will point to some of these things as failure points, or where they feel things may have gone wrong. But this is the natural progression of things. Because in order to answer these questions, we have to enter into the bureaucratization or formalization stage. That is, we have to be able to answer these questions. How do you do this? And people forget, there was a huge amount of resistance to actually defining extreme programming for the longest time. It became this kind of umbrella thing. It's like, well, eventually we have to say, okay, well, what exactly is it we're doing? And same thing with Scrum. You have to kind of define these things. So in this bureaucratization and formalization process, though, you have a bit of a trade-off that has to happen. Because as we are now defining things and codifying them and formalizing them, that means in order to do that, we have to sand down the edgier bits of our movement, right? We can't just be changing things all the time, because no one can keep up then. It won't actually go mainstream. We won't actually get support, because people say, well, I can't understand it, because every day it's something different. Somebody's saying something different. So as we sand down the edgier bits, it becomes more codified. And of course, we saw this with things like the Scrum Alliance and certification. And then you get scrum.org, you have Lean Kanban University, and the Scrum Guide, which again, there was a lot of resistance to even having a Scrum Guide for a while, until I think there was some crazy group that put out this like project management based book and called it the Scrum PMBOK or something. It was some ridiculous thing like that. And they were like, okay, look, we have to have an official something so that some crazy people aren't just coming up with whatever and calling it, this is what Scrum is. And so we end up with the Scrum Guide. The problem, of course, that happens around this time is people look at, and this is part of that shift from innovators to builders, to say, well, instead of figuring out what we need to do, we need to copy what they did. And so now as you get all these things codified in here, you start to get copies. And so I refer to this as Agile generation loss. And for those of you old enough to remember, if you had analog tapes, whether it was an audio cassette tape or a VHS tape, if you made a copy of that copy, well, you had a copy, but it wasn't like a digital copy where it was exact. You started to lose some of the fidelity. The sound got a little garbled. And if you made a copy of that copy, well, it got a little more garbled. And eventually, if you copied it enough times, it would be unrecognizable and unwatchable or unlistenable. And this is what happened with a lot of Agile teams and approaches is, in the early days when you have those innovators, somebody might copy what somebody else was doing, but they would, add something, change it up a bit, and figure out what works for them in that kind of context. And eventually what happens is you get teams that copied what that other team did, but then they wouldn't change any of it. They'd do exactly that and only that, and they wouldn't say, well, okay, well, now I've got to alter it in some way or try my own new thing or try and create something. Again, this can be part of that innovators versus builders problem. And so again, anyone who then copies that group, well, they might copy part of it, but then they might lose something of it. And eventually you end up with these teams that kind of robotically go through the practices, but they don't understand why any of them exists. And they don't actually find a way to actually contribute back and improve things. And so it just gets this weird thing. I'll go into some organizations and I'll see what they're doing, and I'm like, it kind of looks like an Agile thing, but it doesn't actually resemble any Agile teams or companies that I've ever worked with. And I see how they get there because, again, they copied a copy of a copy, and it's like, it's really strange. But that, again, is inevitably a thing that happens. And those copies then end up constraining what is allowed. Well, you can't do that because that's not whatever. That's not Scrum, or that's not how you write user stories, or that's not how you do a daily stand-up. You didn't answer the 3 questions. All those weird things come from copies where people aren't really thinking about what they're doing anymore. They're just copying what other people have done. And so what happens in your movement here is you kind of lose that do-it-yourself edge. It's gone. And all those risk takers start to get pushed out. And the risk, we saw this actually happen. Well, it's now been quite a few years now, but in the early days, there was mob programming was coming out, which has gone through name revisions now, but mob programming is what it came out as, or the no estimates movement. And man, the vicious reaction, again, whether you thought they were right or wrong or whatever, but people push back and say, you can't do that. That's not agile. You can't have no estimates. That's not right. And it's like, well, okay. But if this were, 2004, 2005, 2006, they just say, cool, try it. Let us know how it works. And then they'd share what they did and say, well, okay, maybe I'll try it. Maybe I won't. But that kind of ethos was gone at that point. You can't have that because, if I'm trying to sell Agile higher up in my very large bureaucratic organization and somebody gets wind of, well, what do you mean there's no estimates? It's like, well, we can't do that here then because no estimates. My God, that's not professional, right? There were all kinds of fears and worries about what that could do to the broader adoption, which wouldn't have happened in the earlier stages of the movement. And then, of course, in the end, it gets commercialized and not just to poke fun at SAFe here. It's not the only one, but clearly there are commercial interests that entered into the space that wanted to sell you Agile that were very different from that kind of ethos of do it yourself and let's figure things out. And it's not the same as the context was, let's say, back in 2001. And then so eventually, of course, that means you hit the decline or the institutionalization. And again, I want to remind you that this happens when you're successful. If you weren't successful, you wouldn't have made it this far. So this is a byproduct of success. And I love this quote from Eric Hoffer. He wrote a lot about social movements and the like. And he had this one: every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. And again, he was just defining exactly what happens in these 4 stages of social movements. And it's inevitable. And it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying it, but it is what it is. So let's look at the ways that some movements decline. So there are a few ways that this can happen. It can happen through repression. This is the most often one. And this will happen earlier in a movement where they just say, nope, we're not doing that here. And you probably saw this if you saw this in organizations in the earlier days when people were trying to pitch Agile to them. They're just like, okay, maybe no, never mind. No, we're not going to do this. Shut it down. But other ways it can happen is through organizational failure. And this is the inability for the movement to stay cohesive. And we've seen this happen in the Agile movement. It's what I describe as the everything is Agile problem. You may have seen things like business agility, Agile marketing, Agile this, Agile banking, Agile this, Agile that. And there was Jerry Weinberg in his books, I think it was Secrets of Consulting, had his law of raspberry jam, which is the more you spread it, the thinner it gets. And that's kind of what happened with Agile is, again, if everything is Agile, then nothing ends up being Agile. We used to know what we were talking about, but if you were to talk to someone from Agile marketing about what Agile is versus Agile software development or business agility, it's like they're different things. I mean, yes, there may be overlapping, complementary stuff, but it's not the same because the context is different. And you have to recognize that, and it can be another thing. It can be something inspired by it in the same way. Remember, for, again, people who haven't been around forever, that Agile is very inspired by Toyota and Lean in Japan. And they, obviously Mary Poppin Dick had Lean software development, but it was actually better to rebrand as something different, even though it was inspired by a lot of the things that were going on in that space. The other thing is co-optation. Groups can get co-opted. They can be driven from their original premise and become something else. And so my one question for this is, when I used to give these talks a lot in person, and I'd ask people to raise their hand if they were a software developer. Not many of them around anymore. So where did all the software developers go for, the manifesto for Agile software development? But you don't see many developers anymore. I'm pretty sure we can say there's been some co-optation that's been happening here. Another way is, of course, establishment within mainstream society. And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. When you're on the cover of Harvard Business Review and they're talking about Agile at scale, it's like, great, that is success. And you don't hear people talking about starting that many waterfall projects. That is success. But of course, as we talked about, that means you had to actually strip away a lot of that edgier stuff you had at the beginning of your movement. I mean, part of the reason why a lot of people think that extreme programming didn't take off was so many people complained, "Ooh, does it have to be called extreme though? Like, I don't know if we can adopt at my bank something called extreme." And not necessarily wrong, but that stuff, you lose a bit of your edge. That's all I'm saying. So we have to recognize now that Agile is mainstream. Again, success. Again, there aren't many new waterfall software projects kicking off. New companies are not necessarily starting in a waterfall way. There is a base premise of Agile that has permeated all of software development. So that's great. However, we have to recognize that the revolution then becomes the orthodoxy. And we are now at the point that we were not in 2001, where Agile has become the orthodoxy. So if you're a Star Wars fan, we are no longer the rebels, we are now the Empire. And empires are ripe for disruption. So perhaps that's something we might see very soon in Agile's future. Now, before we get into how this is a good thing, I first want to take a moment to actually do a little deviation to do a defense of Scrum. Because Scrum is often the whipping boy for bad Agile. And it gets a bad rep, and I don't think it's deserved. And I don't think it gets the credit that it deserves. But I also think a lot of people don't really understand the simplicity at the core of what Scrum is. So I will tell you this. Every single company I have coached, every single team I have coached, we go in and we do Scrum, and they say, we want to do Scrum. Okay, let's do Scrum. Scrum, every single time, does exactly what Scrum does. The problem is people don't understand what Scrum does. They hear things, obviously, Jeff Sutherland loves to promote, 100 times faster in, 3/5 the time or whatever, which is nice. And again, it's not necessarily that these things are impossible, but that's more the result of Scrum doing what it's going to do. And you have to understand and be prepared for what Scrum is going to do. So, and I think Ken Schwaber used to talk about this a lot. You can find a lot of old talks online of him talking about this. Scrum takes all the problems in your organization and it makes them very, very painful and very, very visible. And that may sound like a bad thing, but by doing that, it allows you to solve those problems. And thus, as a result of solving the problems, your organization gets better. Here's the catch. When it surfaces these problems, you are supposed to solve them. Many people find themselves in organizations where they say, well, we're going to do Scrum, it surfaces problems, everything's really painful, everybody hates it, we know what the problems are, but we're not going to let you solve them. And now you're just in for a world of hurt. Because if you don't solve the problems, you don't get the benefit. And so I remember there was a team I went in to work for. It was a traditional waterfall team. And we were talking about, okay, well, if we're going to do Scrum, we're going to do sprints. How long should the sprints be? I said, hey, why don't we try 1 week sprints? And I knew this was going to get a big reaction. Oh my God, you would have thought that I had suggested the most heinous thing in the world. That was absolutely impossible. There was outrage, there was yelling, there was screaming, but hey. I said, okay, so don't want to do 1 week sprints. Why not? And somebody said, well, it takes us 3 days to get a build. I said, oh, that's interesting. So let me ask you this. Do you think 1 week sprints is the problem, or the fact that it takes you 3 days to get a build? Right? Scrum, even though they hadn't even started, we had already surfaced a huge problem. So it's like, yeah, 1 week sprints would be extremely painful for you because it takes you 3 days to get a build. So what should we do? Well, we could just not do 1 week sprints. Okay, and maybe in the short term that might be the right answer. Or we should focus on fixing the build. And then when we get the build fixed, that we can actually do a fast build, then we'll see what the next problem is. And we'll solve that. And then we'll solve the next one and the next one. And then you start to get the benefits. Then you start to see the performance. But again, when you get that copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and we're just going to go through the motions of Scrum. We'll do the daily stand-ups. We'll do retrospective. Maybe we'll find improvements there. Maybe we won't. But if we don't actually solve the problems, we don't actually get the benefit. And so Scrum allows you to solve a lot of the waterfall problems. Because again, you don't notice the problem of a 3-day build if you're doing a 6-month waterfall project or a 1-year waterfall project. Because what's 3 days, out of 365? It's not a huge deal. But now try to release every week, and now you'll see the difference. But what people don't understand is though, okay, well, so let's say we now implement Scrum, and we say, okay, so now we're actually doing Scrum, now we're actually solving problems. And we've solved these waterfall problems. We no longer have painful integration sessions. We never have, huge problems of, QA getting crunched at the end and not being able to test things appropriately. Okay, so we've solved the waterfall problems. But the other thing people don't realize is, well, now you have Scrum problems. And people don't talk about that a lot. And they say, well, okay, how do we solve the Scrum problems? And so what are some of the Scrum problems? Well, some of the Scrum problems you'll have is, well, first off, are we actually getting the value we're supposed to out of these practices? Meaning if we go into a retrospective, we identify problems, do we actually fix them? Or sometimes it's things like, our daily stand-up is turned into a status meeting and it's kind of painful and awful. We should fix that. But we have to fix that. That's a Scrum problem, right? Or some people will say, like, why do we have these so many meetings? Because, theoretically, if you're being really successful with Scrum, then you shouldn't have many meetings outside of the prescribed Scrum meetings. And yet what people do is they will have the prescribed Scrum meetings and then they'll keep their original meetings on top of that. It's like, well, that's an interesting problem. It's like, well, how are you going to solve that problem? But even there are still some problems, let's say, just inherent to Scrum. Like, I find sprint planning extremely painful. I would really wish that somebody would come and help and find a better way to actually do sprint planning. That's just me. But again, part of, when you're in that innovator side of things would look at that and say, well, we need to solve that problem. That's a Scrum problem. We can go solve it. But when you're doing copy of a copy of a copy, it's like, no, that's just the way it is, and we just have to deal with it. And that's a different mindset, right? So one of the other criticisms that happens around Scrum is the idea of, Scrum zealots versus, heretics versus the pragmatists. And I think what people really mistake here is that there is a difference between purity, pragmatism, and incompetence. And this has been a real big problem. Again, part of the reason why Scrum gets a very bad rap is that, people say, well, okay, they did Scrum and things didn't work for them and it was awful. And somebody might say, well, were they really doing Scrum? And it's like, oh, that's all you say. Is you just say, it's like no true Scotsman. It's like no true Scrum. Nobody's doing Scrum properly. But here's the reality is there is a lot of incompetent Agile out there. And, you just have to recognize that sometimes people don't know better. And this is part of why you end up in that having to codify things is to say, well, wait, did you actually do this or not? Because I will tell you, some of the companies I've gone in and worked with, they really, and again, not through conscious incompetence, they were smart people, but they were just naive. They just didn't know. So I went and interviewed with one company I ended up working with, and they brought me in and they said, okay, well, we were a waterfall company, and it was very painful, and we decided we're going to start doing Scrum. And man, things are going really well, and we thought maybe we could bring you in and make things even better. I said, cool, that's awesome. What have you been doing? They said, well, between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., we go in the main boardroom and we have our daily Scrum. And I said, okay. I said, and it's fantastic. It solves so many problems. And so I probed a little deeper and I found out basically they were having a 1-hour status meeting every morning. And because nobody was on the same page, it actually allowed them to coordinate and get great improvement. I'm like, that's awesome. What else are you doing? I said, no, that's it. And it's amazing. I'm like, okay, I think we can improve things from here. But again, if you would ask them, they would tell you they were doing Scrum. It's like, well, and if they had failed at that, would you say, that Scrum failed? It's like, it's not even close to what you would expect to see if you saw a team actually doing Scrum. So you also have to look further. People that sometimes wish that things were something closer to what they want to be. So they take, let's say, a particular Agile practice, or whether it's a Scrum practice or whatever, and they interpret it through their existing lens. And we see this a lot when you see waterfall project managers go to Scrum, as they still see everything through a waterfall mindset and a waterfall lens. And again, that's natural, but it's something that you have to correct, right? So this is where you see stand-ups turn into status meetings. I had a project manager who used to come by this team, and man, they hated it when she came by because she would turn their stand-up into a status meeting. She'd ask people, what percent done are you this on this? What percent done are you this on that? And it's like, and again, not her fault. It was like she just knew that I have to report back to the client where things are at. So I need this information. And this is the gathering where you talk about the stuff you did. So this is the place where I should get it, right? So what I did eventually was I pulled her aside and I said, okay, so here's what the stand-up's actually for. It's the team actually coordinating their plan on how they're actually going to, tackle the issues of the day. And I understand you need status. You need to see it. But we have a method of doing that. And I took her over to the whiteboard and said, well, here's all the tasks. You got an item and it's got 4 tasks to it, and 2 of them are done and 2 of them are about to be started. How far are you done on this thing? Well, looks like 50%. That sounds about right. And so then, and again, then she stopped bothering the team to stand up. She would still come and participate, but, it actually turned into a normal stand-up meeting. And then she would derive status from looking at the state of things on the board. And if she had any questions, she could follow up with anyone on the team. But again, that's just when you look at it and say, well, okay, this kind of looks like something I know. I know status meetings, and this looks like a status meeting, so we'll make it a status meeting. And again, if you don't understand the why, because you're doing the copy of a copy of a copy, then there's a very real risk that you kind of pervert what these practices are for, into something that they're not. But this doesn't just go for practitioners or people on teams doing things. Understanding why you were doing what you were doing is one of the most vital things you need to do. So I actually interviewed 3 coaches that were members of a center of excellence at a large organization. And again, they were talking about perhaps I might come in and help them. And so I went and talked with them. That's okay. My first question was, so first they told me, okay, well, we've been a center of excellence for Agile for like a year now. We've been working at this. I'm like, okay, cool, awesome. First question, what problem are you solving for the organization? Silence. Couldn't tell me, couldn't say anything. What problem are you solving for the organization? Said, we don't know. We do this stuff, we arrange trainings, we do stuff like that. It's like, okay, in order for the organization to do what? To improve their time to market, quality, increase innovation, anything at all. Nope. They had no idea. Well, we should probably figure that out. Like, wow, okay. Needless to say, I did not get a call back to work with them. Who knows? Maybe they figured out why they were doing what they were doing. I hope they did. I really do. It's not just that coaching must include learning from competent people who have experience, but it's also learning from competent people who have experience helping solve the problems that you have. They need to know, what problem are we trying to solve here? Because how we frame an engagement, how we're going to try and do things here, is all going to be centered around improving the thing you have a problem with. If I come into an organization, what's your problem? Oh, it takes us forever to get to market. Cool. We're going to focus everything around how we improve your time to market. Okay. What's your problem? Oh, quality is garbage. Okay. We're going to focus all the things around how we're going to do things in order to improve your quality. So you have to have that knowledge of why are we doing the things that we're doing. And again, when you get into that copy of a copy of a copy, you start to lose that sort of stuff. Because there's a difference between a practice, any Agile practice you want, pick whichever one you want. A practice done right in the right context is not the same as a practice done right in the wrong context, which is completely different from a practice done poorly in the right context. So this is why, when people talk about, is Scrum bad? Is this bad? It's like, it's very hard to have that conversation because there are so many different variables at play here, and you have to figure out which one are we actually talking about. Is it that they were doing the right practice in the wrong place? Were they doing it well, but doing the wrong practice? Were they doing it poorly, and they had the right practice, they just didn't know how to do it? It could be any of those combination of things, and that could lead to your Agile pain and problem. So again, we have to look at, are we trying to do what works? Are we just doing what we're told, which is just the copy of a copy of a copy? Or are we just doing whatever we want and we don't know why? And again, doing what works is what we're looking for. Doing what you're told, maybe if it works, is okay. And doing whatever you want, you might luck out and actually end up doing the right thing, but you might end up doing a lot more harm to yourself than good. So it's tough. And so as a result of this, Agile, Scrum gets a bit of a bad reputation. And let's face it, there is some baggage associated with Agile practices. A lot of people have been on Agile teams where they said, man, it sucked. I hate doing this. I hate doing that, or whatever, for a particular reason. And again, whether it's true or not, tons of variables. The reality is that reputation is out there. So we have the option, particularly in 2024 now. We have the option, we can just let go of a lot of that baggage. I mean, some of these practices are very, very old. And should you be doing them? Maybe. But we can just let go of that. But what would we do instead? Because we don't want to just do whatever we want. We don't just want to copy what's out there. So I went through and I thought about this, and I kind of distilled it down to what I call the 5 aspects of Agile. So the 5 aspects of Agile is just kind of extracting out of all these practices, out of all these frameworks, what are the kind of things we've learned after over 20 years of doing this stuff? What have we learned? And can we take those key ideas away regardless of whatever practices are out there and that we're doing? And I think that we can. So the 5 aspects that I identified are the things we've learned about seeing the work, how we see the work itself, what we've learned about understanding the work, how about how we move the work. We've learned some stuff there. What we've learned about crafting the work, and of course, what we've learned about the importance of decentralizing decision making. So let's talk a little bit about each of those. So first, seeing the work. So one thing that happened a lot in the waterfall world was this division of knowledge and responsibilities, that you didn't need to know what was going on in another group. You didn't need to see the state of the work in here, not until it was ready. You know, I worked with one team once, and they had an offshore QA team that would do their testing. And so one of the first things I said was, you got test plans, right? They said, yes. Can I see them? They said, no. I said, why? I said, then you'll know what we're testing for. I'm like, yes. And then you'll make them pass. I said, yes. They were very confused by this. You know, because the way they saw it was their job was to spring these tests on us, to surprise us, to catch us off guard, and then find more bugs. And then that would be good. The more bugs they found, the better they were, right? Which, again, is one of those weird things that when you stop and think about it, you scratch your head. But there are incentives in the industry that were aligned to make this happen. But it was like, you know, don't you want the test to pass? If you want the test to pass, then share the tests and have that level of transparency. So transparency is key. That's one thing we've learned. That's why we had, you know, in the early days, we often talked about information radiators, whether that was, you know, having big boards on the wall, visible charts, whether it was burn down charts, burn up charts, whatever. Just making things visible was so important. And then having that work visible to be able to have the conversation about how are we going to prioritize this work? Because it's very easy to say yes to everything, but it doesn't matter because then nothing is getting done. Because at the end of the day, if you're a developer, let's say, and I have to take a task off the board, I don't care if there's 10 items that are all the same priority, I'm going to pick one. And that one is going to be the one that's done first. So either I get to prioritize it by just choosing whichever one is most interesting to me, or we actually make sure we prioritize that so the one that is chosen next is actually the one we want to be worked on next. And one of the other big learnings around how we see the work, and this really came through when we started to visualize the big picture of how things were going, you know, like through, let's say, value stream mapping, is this idea that it's not done until we're all done. And that's very different than how things worked previously. Again, you know, I could say I'm a business analyst, I'm writing requirements, and once the requirements are written, boom, I can wipe my hands of it, my work is done, and it doesn't matter. But it does matter, because it only matters when that feature is in a customer's hands and they are satisfied with the outcome that they got. That's when we're actually done. And that mindset didn't used to be there. So that's one thing that we definitely learned from there, is it's not done till we are all done. And the other thing, of course, is going back to what we talked about the importance of why, is that we need to have a focus to know what is important, what is guiding our decisions here. Do we have a shared vision for what we're trying to achieve? Because again, if I'm a developer walking up to that board looking for work to do, I can look at this item and say, I'm going to do this work, and I have 2 ways I can approach it. I can do it option A, I can do it option B. Well, what's the difference? Well, you know, to me, it doesn't matter which one, but they're 2 different approaches. Well, if I understand what we're trying to achieve, I might look at that and say, okay, option B is not valid because what we're trying to achieve is this. Otherwise, I just arbitrarily pick, and maybe I pick the wrong one. So next we look at understanding the work. And again, this is something that has shifted thanks to Agile, which is this idea, we now understand that you will not get it right the first time. Because believe it or not, we used to think we could. We used to think that if we planned enough, if we put our heads down enough, if we signed enough documents, if we documented enough things, that we would then have all the information we needed and we could do it right. And then we didn't. And it would fail. And all we would say, actually, another story for a company I worked with at the time, as a software developer, they would build things in a waterfall fashion. You'd have all the usual waterfall problems, all the usual deadlines would be missed, and the customer would be horribly unhappy. And at the end of the day, the CEO would give a company-wide speech, and he'd say, okay, but we learned our lessons from this client. So this time now, we're going to hire more analysts, we're going to do more planning, and we're going to make sure we absolutely build it right from the start. This time, we're going to get it right. And then 6 months, a year later, he'd talk about the new failure and say, well, no, but this time, we're really going to plan things out. And again, this happened over and over and over again. And eventually that company did go out of business. And surprisingly, why? Because again, the other side effect of doing that, by the way, was all of their projects took longer and longer and longer because they would do so much more upfront planning. And if only they had thought, hey, maybe we're not going to get it right the first time. What if we did things a bit differently? And so one thing we've also learned is the idea that if you build it, they probably won't come. We like to think that we have this idea that our customers are going to love and that we're going to build it, we're going to put it out there, and they're just going to flock to it, but probably not. But if we can test early and find out, we can actually find out what exactly it is will drive their behavior, will bring them to us, what will truly excite them in small experiments, and we'll figure out what they actually want. And in order to do this, of course, we learned that we have to release early and release often. So those 6 months and annual releases, those had to go. We had to find ways to get to market sooner. And again, through doing this process, you also have to learn to inspect and adapt. And that was a big thing that came out. I remember Ken Schwaber talking a lot about this in Scrum, right? That empiricism. We have to inspect and adapt. We have to learn. We have to improve as we go along. And of course, this led to what we picked up from Eric Ries in Lean Startup, which is this idea of validated learning, which is to build, measure, and learn along the way. And one of the final things, which I find a little controversial, I'll talk about it a bit later, and that is this idea that we should really cut our losses quickly. And this again came from Lean Startup, which is the idea of the minimum viable product, another term which has sadly been misconstrued, and now you can't even talk about it. It doesn't mean anything to anyone. But the premise behind it, again, is if we are building the wrong thing, what's the smallest thing we can do to find that out? How do we find that out quickly? That way we can stop building it and go build something else. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Next, we have to look at moving the work. What did we learn about moving the work? Well, we learned a lot about flow, about how work flows through the system. Because when we stop thinking about, well, I've done my part, and instead start thinking about it's the work all the way through to the end, we start to think about, well, what gets in the way of flow? And how do we improve flow? And this led to us, of course, learning about things about limiting work in progress. And a lot of people put this on simply Kanban because they visually see the columns with the numbers of the WIP limits. But Scrum also limits work in progress, and it does that through the sprint. Again, if you have a 2-week sprint or a 1-week sprint, that limits the amount of work you have in progress. Whatever you plan for that sprint is the work you're supposed to do. You've limited the work in progress. So again, going along with this was this idea that we needed small releases. We needed to reduce the batch size, which reduces risk and also allows us to inspect and adapt and improves our learning. This also allows us to get to value sooner. If we're delivering products to the market, the sooner we can get value, whether that's some form of monetization from the customer or some sort of feedback, whatever it is, we can get that value sooner by having those small batches. Then the things we've learned about crafting the work. So one thing we've learned about crafting the work, again, is it's really good to actually give the people building the work autonomy. It turns out the people closest to the work have the better ideas on how to actually build it. So rather than having, somebody 3-4 levels above, tell you this is how you're going to build everything, and then you have to build it that way, whether you think it's the right way or the wrong way, even though you're there looking at saying this is not going to work. Nope, too bad. The person 3 levels above you told you that's the way it's got to be done, and then you run into the problem and say, hey, I kind of saw that coming. But now we can get rid of that if you actually allow the people who are doing the work to have their input and autonomy on how that work gets accomplished. We also learned about cross-functional teams. That is, can we bounce ideas off all the people with all the skill sets that we need to actually get this thing from point A to point B? Again, that flow. So, what if the designers are sitting and working with the developers, that are working with the testers, that are working with the product people? Whatever it is, having all those minds together, working together, will help not only with the generation of ideas, but also with the next one, which is it will help us in reducing handoffs. Because what we've learned, another thing we learned is when we start looking at the work going across the flow, that value stream, we say, what do we notice? Well, what we notice is that so much of this work, it's not that people are working slow. It's not that the programmers aren't typing fast enough. It's that most of the time is spent waiting for the work. Somebody put together the design document, and that's got to sit and wait to be approved. Oh, but now it's approved, but now they got to wait for the team to pick it up. And now they got to do the technical documents, and then once that's done, it's got to wait to be approved. And then once it's approved, it's got to sit and wait until the team is ready to build it, and so on and so forth. And all this wait time is actually making it harder for you to get to market sooner. And so we've learned that. The other is, of course, being test-driven. That idea that, again, if we know in advance what we are trying to do, then we can learn from that faster. And that goes not just on the software development side, but also on the product side of things. Again, if we are running an experiment on a product we are developing, we're A/B testing something or we're doing something, if in advance we have a hypothesis of how we think this is going to go, well then, when it turns out to either go or not go that way, we have an objective measure to say, did we actually achieve the result we were setting out to do? And again, maybe we were, maybe we did, maybe we didn't. But the only way we will know is if we actually, ahead of time, figure out what that test is going to be, and then at the end, validate that that test criteria either was met or not met. And one of the final things we learned around crafting the work is a very simple idea, which is, of course, automation is speed. The more things you can automate, the faster you will go. Very simple, good thing to keep in mind. And the final section, the final aspect here is decentralizing decision making, because there is a difference between, again, centralizing authority and decentralized authority. And going back to that autonomy from crafting the work, we understand that we need to move authority to the information. So we want to make sure that the people who have that information that's coming to them can do something about it. And this goes all across your entire organization, whether that be, a software bug comes in. Do they know what they can do about it? Whether it's customer service, somebody calls up with a problem. Can they remedy that customer's problem, or do they have to escalate 3 levels up the chain? Again, if they have the authority and they have the information, they can say, I know what this is. I know how to fix it. I'm going to do it. And in fact, this is one of the big things that we saw come out of DevOps, right? So the idea was, people, I was one of those people who would get paged at 3 and 4 in the morning, and it's like, well, okay, now I have to deal with this thing, and I can't do anything about the root cause about it. Let's say if you're an operations person, or if you're on a maintenance team, and it's like, I have to deal with this problem, and I can resolve the problem, let's say temporarily, but if I'm not the developer who developed it, then I may not be able to implement a long-term solution. However, if we move those alerts and they go to the person who actually created the feature and it says, I'm getting an alert at 3 in the morning and that kind of sucks, but wait, I think I know what's causing this. I think I know how I can fix this. They're going to take that back to their team and say, hey, we can fix this issue so it never becomes an issue again, and they can solve that problem. But that only happens, again, if the information and the authority to do something about it and the ability to do something about it are connected. So one of the other things we've learned is that we have to stop disempowering people. For a long time, you hear organizations give lip service to empowering people, but there's actually very little you can do to empower someone. The problem is most of what happens in organizations today is about taking power away from people. Oh, this team released something and it had a bug in it and it was a problem. So now we're not going to allow them to release anymore. We're going to take that power away from them and they're going to have to get an approval. And then this could go on years and years away. They never get the power back. They never get the authority to make decisions, even if they've improved and figured out the root cause and they're not having problems anymore. It doesn't matter. We have to go 3 levels up the chain in order to have a decision done because we took away their power because something happened sometime. It's like, well, okay. Maybe we should stop doing that and instead say, well, okay, there was a problem, but how are you going to fix it? How are you going to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future? And this goes back to things like reducing the batch size that we talked about and, releasing early and releasing often. is we can reduce risk of things through experiments and having things that are safe to fail. Because part of the reason why you have to go 3 or 4 levels up your organization is because, well, if something fails, it's catastrophic. And so, of course, if I have a development team that's going to release something, but if it goes badly, it's going to cost millions of dollars to the organization. Of course, I'm going to want it approved by 6, 7 people to make sure absolutely nothing goes wrong. But contrary to that, if we have a small change that if it goes wrong will immediately be rolled back, well then I'm not as worried because we have safety in that. We've built that in there. And again, that is through making sure here's an experiment we're going to run. Maybe it's only going to go to so many users or whatever it is. We can actually control the risk that way as opposed to taking power away from the teams. The other thing, of course, is we want to decentralize the idea of why we do the things we do. So we want to build clarity and competency into our teams. That is, are they competent enough to solve these problems? Hopefully. And not only do they have the ability to do it, but do they understand why we do the things we do so they have the clarity of vision to know what a solution looks like? So that, if they could approach things, and I've seen this many times in organizations where they say, wait, why would you do that? They say, well, it solved the problem. It's like, well, okay, it solved the problem, but we're trying to do this much bigger thing here, and that just made things much worse. It's like, oh, I didn't know. So you want to solve that problem. You want to make sure that clarity is there. And again, going back to that kind of idea of the notifications and kind of people getting paged in the middle of the night, is again, you want to make sure that people feel the consequences of their decisions. If I make a bad decision, I should be the one that learns very quickly, painfully, that it was a bad decision. It shouldn't be pushed off onto someone else, some other group, that then has to suffer, and then I don't suffer. I saw this in an organization once where they had a team that was like their feature team. They would build the features, and then they had a maintenance team which would have to maintain the features. And I ran an exercise with them, and they came up with a slogan for one of their teams. And the team that did the features made their slogan, we build it, you fix it. And that was the slogan. Yeah, I think it was we break it, you fix it, or we build it, you fix it. I forget which it was. And the other team did not take too kindly to that, with good reason. And that's exactly the point. It's like if they don't feel the consequences of their actions, they are incentivized to not care as much or not take as much care in what they are doing. It's just human nature. So the thing you have to recognize is that the practices that you use, whether it be from Scrum, whether it be from Kanban, whether it be something unrelated like story points or user stories or whatever it is, doesn't matter. Any practice. Those practices are there to support these aspects, these things that we've learned. So if you're just taking Scrum practices and applying them to a different context, I beg you, just please stop it. Stop it. But this also means that if you understand these aspects, if you understand what we're trying to achieve, then you also don't have to be a slave to these practices. You can actually do different things. You can question old practices. You can say, hey, we do sprints. Should we do sprints? We do, sprint reviews. We do demos. Should we do those things? We've been using user stories. Should we do those things? Retrospective, stand-ups. We should be able to ask these questions, but because we have a grounding and understanding the aspects of Agile that I just discussed, the why these things work, the what we've learned about these things, then you can actually make an informed decision about whether you should be doing these things. So I'll give you an example of 2 teams that I worked with. And both of them came to me and said they don't want to do a sprint review anymore with the customer. And they said, well, should we do a sprint review anymore? I said, okay, well, tell me. Why don't you want to do a sprint review? And one team came to me and they said, we don't want to do the sprint review because we went and did the sprint review and we got chewed out so bad from our sponsors, from our customers, that it was just an awful experience. We don't want to do it again. So what do you think? Should they just stop doing sprint reviews? Of course not. They need to do more of them, right? And I had a separate conversation with their different stakeholders to say, okay, let's figure out how you approach this to actually do it in a better, more constructive way. But they needed to know that they were on the wrong path. Because if they didn't do the sprint review, they were doing 2-week sprints. It wouldn't have been 2 weeks that they learned this. It would have been 6 months worth of work that they learn this. And that would have been a much worse outcome for them if they did that. So for them, it was like, no, you need to be doing these things and perhaps even more. Then I had another team come to me and they said, well, we don't really know if we want to do sprint reviews anymore. I said, well, okay, why? And they said, well, we actually bring our customers in, like at the end of each day, they come in and check out stuff and we show them where we're at. And so by the time we get to the end of the sprint, they've already seen everything. They already know everything and they kind of feel like it's a waste of time. It's like, maybe it is. Maybe it is at that point, right? Because again, what is the purpose of the sprint review? The purpose of that sprint review is we want to get feedback and see, are we on the right track? Do we need to change things? Are there things coming up we need to know about? If you're getting that through another method or another practice, awesome. Use a different practice. It doesn't matter. It's about, are you getting that value? And if you're losing it, then what are you trading off? So think about this. If you are a team today that's, let's say, doing mob programming, and you were doing Scrum, you say, well, we started doing mob programming. Do you need to do sprints? Do you need to do a daily Scrum, a daily stand-up? Maybe, maybe not. And again, what you decide is still going to be up to you, but you have to ask yourself, if we all get together and we're all working on the same item at the same time, maybe we still want to have that. We like that, having that kind of kickoff where everybody kind of gets together and chats about what we're going to do today beforehand. So maybe they want to keep the stand-ups. Or maybe they say, hey, let's just get right into it. We're all here. We're all doing this. We're going to figure it out as we go along. It's good. And again, same thing with sprints. If they're doing a single piece flow through there and they're going all the way to launching into production right at the end as soon as the feature is ready, maybe they like having that heartbeat of having that structure around a sprint. Maybe they don't. But now they can do it and they can say, well, wait, what does this give us? And are we getting that value from somewhere else? And that's when you see real maturity in teams. Because it's time, instead of just Agile, instead of copy of a copy of a copy, it's time for people to start doing Agile with their brain on. And I think we've had too many years of teams and organizations just trying to turn their brain off and do, again, what was codified, what was told, this is how you must do it. And they don't think through these things. And so you really have to do Agile with your brain on. And it's really important now more than ever that we do this, because no one is coming to save your Agile. This idea, this reputation around Agile, it's going to be there. There's nothing you can do about it. And that's why Agile is dead. It's because, again, people have a certain way they feel about it, and it's not going to change. And some people love it, and some people hate it. It doesn't matter. Spending time arguing about Agile, about how the Agile way of doing things is not going to solve your problems. So let's talk about why that's a good thing. And the reason why that's a good thing is because Agile doesn't matter. Right? All the things I talked about here, we're talking about how do we solve problems that we have. There are problems we have, there are problems our customers have, there's problems our teams and our organizations have. And again, going back to why did I get into Agile? I didn't get into Agile to do Agile. It was to solve the problems that we were having in our organization. So if Agile doesn't matter, then what matters? You matter. You're the one who matters. You're the one who has to go in every day and do the work and figure out how you get things done. How do we actually have a good work environment, a good team relationship, good organizational process that actually delivers value that everyone is happy with? So we end up with, you as a happy individual, you and a happy team in a happy department or organization, and with happy customers. Right? That's what we want, right? So fixing your organization matters, and you need to fix it for yourself, so your life ends up better. And for those that you work with, your teammates, your team members, the people you work for, the business you work for. So that's what's important, not about defending Agile or, all this stuff about whether you should be doing Scrum, whether you should be doing this. Like, this is the stuff that matters. And I will tell you this, because there's a lot of things, I'll go into a few of them now. There's a lot of things that people don't tell you, that you don't learn in the Agile Manifesto, that you don't learn in a Scrum class, you don't learn in a book somewhere talking about Agile stuff. The one thing I've learned working with teams and organizations about teams that succeed and organizations that have succeeded with Agile and those which have failed. And there's number one common denominator that people never talk about. You probably haven't heard this from anyone else. And that is will. Does the organization, does the team, do they have the will to do what they need to do to succeed, to solve their problems, right? Going back to, you have a problem. Scrum has surfaced a problem. Will you solve it? Will your organization do the thing that needs to be done to fix the problem? Because it doesn't matter. If you're not going to do it, you're not going to do it. And that's as far as you're going to get. And maybe that's some success. For example, going back to that company that was doing a 1 hour daily Scrum status meeting, they were having great success with that. If that was all they were willing to do, then that was all the success they were ever going to get. It was never going to get better than that because they weren't willing to do anything else. In this case, they were, and they got a lot more success. Again, the difference is, what are you willing to do? So the other thing to recognize is that scaling is a myth. Came all the fad, scale agile framework, scale this, less that. Scaling itself is a myth because it's not what you actually need to do to succeed. And in fact, we see a lot of organizations, newer organizations, that are having much better success without actually scaling. You don't need to do it. So the old model, which I worked in a lot of companies that worked in this old model, was you would build stuff, sell it to people, get more money, hire more people to build more stuff, to get more money, to hire more people. This is how you scaled. You scaled your organization this way. The problem is, that's not what actually happens. People think that's what happens, but that's not actually what happens. So what happens instead is you build more stuff, you get more money, you hire more people. But now you have more people to manage. And now you have more levels of communication. And now things are getting more complex. So now you're building more stuff, getting more money, hiring more people, but now you need more bureaucracy, you need more governance, you need more management, you need more oversight, because you got to keep all those people on the same page. Going back to getting everyone aligned on the vision of what we're trying to do here. Now you have more and more people that you have to align. And in order to do that, you have to hire more and more people, not just to do the work, but to manage the work. And so what happens, of course, is, maybe you're making X amount of dollars and you hire more people and you think, well, okay, if I had one team doing this, if I had 2 teams, I'd be making twice as much. Or if I had 3 teams, I'd be making 3 times as much. But you don't. You don't do that. What happens is, of course, you have 2 teams, now you have to add more overhead. That overhead costs more money. Hire a 3rd team. You think you're getting 3 times the money, but you're going to spend more and more money on this oversight. You're not getting the success that you want. So when you do this, eventually you can't scale anymore. You start to collapse under your own weight. There's so much bureaucracy, it's so hard to get anything done that you actually don't produce as much value. You end up getting less money, making less profit, and your organization kind of stagnates, and then it kind of becomes one of those big bureaucratic organizations that most people don't want to work for. But there is a new model. It's a new model that is not focusing on building stuff, because again, building stuff was never the goal. Again, it's, can we solve problems for our customers? And we can do that. Sometimes we have to build more stuff. Sometimes we have to remove stuff, or sometimes we just have to do things a little bit differently. So the new model is, we want to build a team, not a team that can build stuff, though they will need to build some things, but we want to build a team that can solve problems. And then they go out and they look and they find what I call asymmetrical problems. So the problem is, if you're building something that is of marginal value, your risk is through the roof, right? So now you're building stuff and it's like, well, okay, we'll build this project and we can make a small percentage on its success. Well, if you run behind for some reason, if you underestimated the effort that was going to be involved, it becomes more complex, or maybe the value you thought was going to be there isn't really as much as you thought it was going to be, it's very easy for that project to go from a marginally successful thing you built to a money pit that you lose a bunch of money on. So instead, what you want to find is asymmetrical problems, things that take a little bit to solve. Maybe you don't have to build a huge amount of stuff, but the value that you can get in return from that is astronomically more than what you put into it, and then solve those problems. And then when you make more money with that, rather than just say, well, let's just build another, more stuff onto this thing. No. If it's making the value, let it make the value. And then maybe you have another problem solving team that finds another asymmetrical problem, rather than trying to scale this solution here. And we have real world examples of this. For example, one of the big ones is Craigslist. So Craigslist is not the most UI fancy, most attractive site, and yet Craigslist has been running and making money for 20 years now, over 20 years I think, and they still have a staff of only about 50 people. And again, a staff of 50 people compared to the value that Craigslist brings in is not very much, right? That's a huge asymmetrical benefit. So we think about Instagram. Instagram's huge, right? So Instagram was bought by Facebook, but before they were bought by Facebook, Facebook paid $1 billion for them, by the way. And when they paid $1 billion for Instagram, Instagram had a total of 13 people employed for them. 13 people. And again, huge value there, right? To get sold for $1 billion. And another Facebook acquisition is WhatsApp. So Facebook bought WhatsApp for $19 billion. And at the time, the total number of people at WhatsApp was 55 people. So again, if you are solving hugely asymmetrical problems, then you can do that with fewer people and you don't have to worry about scaling quite as much because building is not the goal. For the longest time, people think about software as service companies where we get paid for building things. And the more we build, the more we get paid. But it turns out the world isn't like that. People will pay for less if it solves their problem. In fact, more simple a solution is people will often pay even more for that because it's less complicated for them to use. So we have to be aware of this high risk of marginal benefit initiatives. So what you want to do again, and this is for my product people in the audience, you want to make sure that you are solving problems and seizing opportunities. And first, always work to solve problems first. Because there are a lot of problems out there. But then if you're like, well, you know what, we've solved a lot of the problems, then see, is there a new opportunity out there that we might be able to dip into? But again, first, always work at solving the problems. There are an awful lot of problems just within your organization and for your customers and in the greater market that you can solve, that you can do simply and reap a lot of value for doing that. And next is, of course, to stop buying Agile. And that was the thing. It became all the rage. People needed Agile coaches. They needed to buy consulting. They needed to buy, a safe rollout. Again, Agile is not the point. The point is to solve the problem you have in your organization. Buying Agile, again, Agile approaches might be the way that you approach things, but that's not why you're doing things. So your solution is not, did we train these teams? Did we roll out Agile in our company? Who cares? I don't care. I don't care how many teams you trained. I don't care, how rigid they follow a particular Agile process or approach. It doesn't matter. If it's not solving the problem for your organization, don't do it. Do the things that solve the problems in your organization. And, I mentioned before about cutting losses quickly and failing fast. And this has been a real problem in the Agile community is we all talk about failing fast, but nobody does it. Nobody actually fails fast. And they should. They need to fail a lot more. We need to cancel more products, cancel more projects. If you are on the wrong track, scrap it. And there's a huge amount of people that are stuck in the sunk cost fallacy that say, well, hey, once we've approved this initiative, we'll figure it out. We'll make it work. It's like, no, you won't. There is a better opportunity for you out there. Go and find it. Go and do it. And one of the things you have to recognize, of course, is for those people that are building out more teams, that are building out larger organizations or going to work in larger organizations, bureaucracy is the enemy. I'll say it again. Bureaucracy is the enemy, and it is a formidable enemy. All that stuff contributes to wait time. It contributes to a lack of innovation. It contributes to not solving the problems that need to be solved. And you have to make sure that you are reducing bureaucracy as much as possible. That doesn't mean you completely eliminate it because there is a flip side to that, which is you do not wish to descend into chaos. Because I will say this too. Again, people talk about doing Scrum in organizations. I have gone into bureaucratic organizations where the idea of doing something like Scrum is very radical, and they have to dismantle so much bureaucracy in order to have any success with it. And it's like, cool. Scrum helped you do that. Scrum helped you reduce your bureaucracy. Good, great. But I've also gone into organizations where it's absolute chaos. Every day, everyone's just putting out fires. Nobody has any plan. Nobody has any vision or approach to what they're trying to do. They are just trying to stay alive day to day, and it's awful. It's a horrible place to be. Then they come in and start doing Scrum, and it's like, man, it's so much better. We have this structure, right? And so for some people, they look at Scrum and they say, my God, that's so rigid. And some people look at it and say, oh my God, that's not rigid enough. We have so much stifling bureaucracy here. And again, it's you need some semblance of order, but you do not want to have so much bureaucracy that it's stifling. And again, you want to have the creativity that comes from being a little bit more chaotic, but again, you don't want to descend into chaos. So again, this is a reminder, I don't have all the answers for you here. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, or as Arthur C. Clarke said, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but the questions are certainly worth thinking about. So these are some of the interesting things that I have come up with, some thoughts on the journey that I've been on in this space and talking with people and working with organizations and teams. And so I ask you this question. Did you ever think that 2001, when the Agile Manifesto came out, did you ever think it'd be a cool time to be uncovering new ways of working and helping others to do it? If you thought that was cool and you were tired and you didn't want the copy of a copy of a copy, well, then guess what? Now's your chance. Now that Agile's kind of on the ropes and people are kind of shying away from it, and now's your chance to actually say, well, how do we create something better based on what we've learned from Agile? How do we find better ways of working? Remember uncovering better ways of working for doing it and helping others to do it? I want you to do that. Because once you understand the rules, once you understand why these things work, why we do the things we do, then you can break the rules. And so I give you permission to break all the rules. Go for it. Because we need to bring back that DIY ethic. Because we are uncovering better ways. We have to get back to uncovering better ways. And that's what I want you to do. So if you take anything away from this talk, just understand we've come a long way. We are not in the same place we were back in 2001. But we need to bring that ethic back, and I hope that you will do it.